You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 263.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. How is everybody doing today? Very excited to be here to share with you my 5-year anniversary episode of the podcast. I started the Cookbook Love Podcast on September 6th, 2018, and here we are, released this podcast episode September 21st, 2023, episode 263. Episodes every Thursday for the past 5 years, except for the week this past March, I believe. I missed a Thursday when my mother passed away. So I wanted to start, I guess, first with a story. When I started this podcast, I was working as a cookbook writing coach, and one of my students who had a background in marketing asked me when I told him about the podcast what my ROI was. And I hadn't been doing the podcast for that long at that point. And of course, the question that they asked was valid. What was my return on investment? And what was I seeing in terms of financial reward for the time I was investing in the podcast and the money that I was investing in the podcast? I had bought a microphone, invested in a pair of headphones. I had invested in having someone help me produce the episodes. I was spending time doing posts about the episodes. And, you know, when you invest time and money in something, that is an investment. And what was my ROI? And I hadn't been doing the podcast but probably 6 months at that point. And I hadn't really thought too much about the financial return then. And I guess my reason is because I started this podcast because I wanted to talk about cookbooks, and I loved cookbooks, and that's really at the heart of why I started the podcast. And, you know, you can get a microphone and a pair of headphones and use Audacity and open up your laptop and talk about pretty much whatever you want to talk about and put it out on a podcast. So I decided it was going to be about cookbooks. And I've probably invested close to $10,000 over the past 5 years. I've, in return, received a lot from this podcast financially and not financially. Students have joined my programs because of the podcast. I know people have been impacted in a positive way because of the podcast. People have attended my recipe writing workshops because of the podcast. And I have learned and grown a lot as a person through my dedication to this podcast. So I wanted to share with you specifically 5 different returns on investment that I have received by being committed to showing up every week and releasing a podcast episode for you to listen to and for you to learn from, for you to enjoy, and for me to share. Number 1. I'm pretty good at starting things. I have tons of ideas. And I kind of talked about this back in the podcast episode when I was doing the Summer Roadblock series. One of the things that holds people back from starting something is they say they have so many ideas, they don't know what to start. And I've become a person that if I have a lot of ideas, that's fine. I think it's great to have a ton of ideas. But if you want to start something, you have to pick something and you have to go with it and you have to stay committed to it. And do it consistently and do it to the best of your ability, the highest quality that you can. And that's what I did with this podcast. And one of the returns on investment then is I have gotten to start it. I've gotten to stay consistent with it and watch it grow and evolve over time. It started as a baby podcast with no listeners all the way through the pandemic, now into 2023, consistently recording an episode for you every week episodes that have varied from 15 minutes to over an hour and a half, depending on who I was talking to and what I was talking about. But it is really fun to start something and watch it grow and evolve. And not to use the analogy of children, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's the same thing for a baby. A baby begins as a baby and they grow and they evolve into something that develops a personality and doesn't really look or resemble what they looked like when they started. Although the Cookbook Love Podcast does resemble itself in a lot of ways from the beginning, but it has definitely grown and evolved. The amount of downloads have evolved. The amount of subscribers have evolved. The awareness of the podcast in the cookbook writing and publishing space has evolved. And I think it's been really rewarding and a good return to watch that happen. So that's the first return on investment, is just this starting and watching it grow and evolve through the constant care and attention that I've given the podcast. Number 2 is I get to talk about something I love. And I get to talk to people who enjoy and love cookbooks also. And I've gotten to meet and work with some amazing people as a result of the podcast. The first person who's been with me from the very beginning is Scott Donnell. He is my podcast producer. He's very faithful to this work. I send him the files. He produces the show and sends them back to me, and I upload the files to Libsyn. And then in the meantime, we'll share back and forth stories about what's going on in our life. We've swapped recipes. We've talked about Thanksgiving. He's been a great podcast producer, and I could have done this without him, but I decided from the beginning that I did not want to produce my own shows. And I wanted someone else to be available to do that for me. Let him do what he's good at, and I'll do what I'm good at. And part of the investment that I've made is in paying him to do this work, but it's been totally worth it. And I can't thank him enough for the work that he has done. Behind the scenes, I have a VA, virtual assistant. Her name is Eloisa, and she has been consistently with me also for the past 5 years. She puts the posts up on the cookbooklove.co website and gets Libsyn hooked up to the website so that people can listen to the podcast off the website if they don't want to listen to it through a podcast app like Apple Podcast, Spotify, or Google Podcast. And then the people that I've talked to on the show, unbelievable people, cooks, bakers, PR agents, literary agents, cookbook editors, all different cookbook collectors, people who've started cookbook clubs, people who love to read cookbooks, just amazing people, all gathered around this one topic of a cookbook. And all you have to do is scroll back through the feed of the podcast to see any number of people talking about any number of things, but it's all related to either a cookbook they wrote, they promoted, they edited, they read, they loved, they collected, they had a club around it. It's so fun to put something like our love for cookbooks at the center of this podcast and to meet all the people that surround the production and the enjoyment of them. So that's number 2, the connection with the people that I have been connected with. Number 3 has been watching the shift in the podcast from being something that I felt like I was doing all by myself and I was pushing this boulder up the hill to now having a presence in the space with public relations agents and publishers and cookbook authors and listeners and people knowing that I'm here and that I'm available to help them get on the show and talk about their books and introduce their book to a new audience. Because cookbook writing is kind of a lonely journey, but when you get to talk about your book, you want to have audiences that can discover new books. And I always hope that you get to discover new books and new writers and authors through the work that I do here on the Cookbook Love Podcast. And as a result of that, I have cookbooks now being mailed to me. They arrive on my doorstep every week, new cookbooks for me to review, consider for the show, and enjoy. Used to have a stack on the table of ones cookbook writers and authors I've talked to and ones that have not been on the show yet. And it's just incredible that this love of cookbooks and cookbooks I used to have to buy are now just coming into my life, appearing from people that want me to see them and want us to perhaps give the writer of that book a platform on our show. And I love doing that. I think it's a great act of service, and I hope as listeners you all enjoy it from a couple perspectives. If you're a writer, that you can glean some tips from the authors about perhaps something that they did in the recipe writing, testing, development stage, or in the manuscript writing, contract negotiations, book production, book marketing, something that means something to you. And for those of you that like to read and collect cookbooks, that you'll maybe find some new books and some stories about cookbooks that you maybe wouldn't have heard before. So that's number 3, the shift in the way that the podcast is recognized in the space, and the beautiful cookbooks that are being sent to me has been really a wonderful return on investment. And number 4 relates to Ted Lasso. I want to tell you a little story. Every night when I get ready for bed, I brush my teeth, wash my face, put my pajamas on, and I have a big male black cat. You maybe have seen him if you've been on any of my calls on Zoom. It's funny, I was just doing a call last night with my cookbook community. I had something called a Cookbook Curious call. It was a time for anyone to come on and I can answer questions about their cookbook project. And he was just literally like right in the middle of it from the very beginning. I had to like move him off the table. He even like kind of swatted at my hand when I went to write something on my whiteboard. He's a bad cat, but at night when I get ready for bed, one of the things I do to kind of relax and decompress before I go up to sleep is I watch reruns of Ted Lasso. I love the show Ted Lasso. I like a lot of the messages that it talks about, a lot of the themes throughout the show. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm watching the 3rd season now. I'm almost to the end. I think I've watched the whole show through. This might be the 3rd time. But I lay down on this couch and my cat jumps up and lays right beside me when I watch Ted Lasso. And we have a little quiet time. And as a result of watching Ted Lasso, I started listening to the podcast called What Would Ted Lasso Do? And this morning on my walk, I was listening to the show about the 3rd season. I think it's the 3rd to last show, called The International Break. And their take-home message from this show was, am I owning who I am, even if the external world doesn't always get it or agree? Am I comfortable with who I am? Am I proud of who I am? And then the second thing is, it's important that we all remember what brings us joy and what nurtures us and ourselves. Because when we remember those things that bring us joy, connection with other people, cooking, sharing meals, cookbooks, whatever it is, and we're nurturing ourselves with those things, we are better people for the world. So the 4th return on investment is this podcast helps me to remember what brings me joy. And it helps to nurture me in a way that the world may never fully understand. Cookbooks and cooking and recipes and stories and food are not for everybody. I never expected them to be for everybody. I didn't pick a topic that everybody would come flocking to. But for those of you that listen, that understand what I'm talking about, you get it. And if cookbooks bring you joy, and cooking and reading recipes and reading cookbooks and stories and talking about food nurtures you and helps you to live a more joy-filled life, I am totally here for it. And that has been a huge ROI for me, is just to remember at the heart of why I do this, that it's called Cookbook Love for a reason. And Ted Lasso and the International Break Show and the Ted Lasso podcast, What Would Ted Lasso Do? Thank you for helping me to remember that. And then number 5, the 5th return on investment is I get to give and not count the cost. I never know where what I'm going to say is landing, with who it's landing, how it's being received. But I do try to record every episode with the attitude of giving and sharing in helping people promote their books, helping you discover new books, and helping us all to remember why we love this genre of books called cookbooks. And we all want so much in our lives. We all have desires to receive things. But I think the thing that we always have to remember is that in order to receive something, we have to make space in our lives for what we want to receive. And that's to make the space, we have to give things away. We have to first be the one that reaches out and shares and makes the space so that something new can come into our life. And I've watched that happen time and time again with this podcast. From starting from the beginning, no listeners, to now being probably in the top 25% of podcasts that gets over 100 downloads in the first 7 days of a release for the podcast. That's kind of a little marker that I have been striving for. Downloads are considered to be important. And I'm not in the top 1% of podcasts. I never really strive to be. But the fact that I have reached the top 25%, not only in the terms of the first 7-day downloads, but also in the length of time and the number of episodes I've done, I'm very proud of that. And I've been willing to give and not count the cost and not be focused always on the ROI, because I never really knew exactly what would happen and where this would land. So this leads me to kind of talk about what's going to happen next with the podcast. I don't see and foresee any changes in the immediate future. I think it's time that this podcast become a platform where we perhaps excited about some of the things that I may be starting as a result of the podcast and in addition to the podcast to help build community with you. No matter whether you're a reader, a writer, a collector, or someone who has a cookbook club. The second thing is I want to invite readers, collectors, and clubs to remember that I want to talk to you as well. If you don't reach out to me, or maybe I haven't made the invitation enough, but I would love to talk to you. So the best way to get in touch with me is to go to my website at greenapron.com, go to the contact page and send me a message if you have a cookbook collection or you'd like to come on the show to talk about the cookbooks you collect or the cookbook club that you run. Again, greenapron.com, go to the contact page and send me a message. And that's it for the podcast. That's my 5 ROIs. I got to watch something grow. I got to talk about something I loved. I got to have cookbooks arriving on my doorstep. I got to remember what brings me joy and what nurtures me, and that's cookbooks and cooking and reading recipes and reading stories, talking about food, and then I get to give and not count the cost. So that is it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. Thank you all so much for being listeners of the show, and as always, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.